The late autumn sunlight spread evenly over the lush green grass of Jefferson National Cemetery, where rows of white tombstones stood in perfect alignment, like soldiers at attention. The air was heavy and sacred, as though frozen in time. A gentle breeze stirred the massive American flag, hanging at half-mast. On the ceremony grounds, hundreds of uniformed individuals stood silently, their eyes fixed on the flag-draped coffin of Captain Marcus Ward. Just in front, Lieutenant General Althea Ward, the first black woman in U.S. history to hold the position of Chief of Staff of the International Peacekeeping Forces, stood tall like a living monument. Her ceremonial military uniform was perfectly pressed, and the rows of medals on her chest gleamed under the sunlight, like stubborn stars refusing to set. Her hands were neatly placed before her belly, but her eyes were vacant. It was not because she didn't feel the pain, but because she had surpassed that pain with military discipline, the one thing that kept her steady on the day of her only son's funeral. The bugle sounded, taps the most sacred memorial music in the U.S. military. Each note seemed to tear through the air, like the trumpet was crying for those who could not express their sorrow. Hundreds of heads bowed in unison. A minute of silence began. Time seemed to stop. A young soldier stepped forward, white with a slender but firm build, carrying the folded flag in the shape of a triangle. He was the commander of the honor guard. His eyes were red, but his movements were precise down to the millimeter as he handed the flag to Lieutenant General Althea Ward. She raised her hand to accept it. In that instant, a sharp voice shouted, "Stop! You are under arrest for threatening national security." Everyone froze. A police officer stepped forward from the security team, his gun drawn, aimed directly at General Ward's temple. It was Bradley Kane, the officer in charge of the funeral security today. White, his face flushed with either anger or fear, his eyes glazed like someone losing control. She's drawing a suspicious object. "Level 2 alert," he yelled, pressing his Glock against General Ward's head. A wave of shock spread through the crowd like an electric shock. Hundreds of people stood motionless, no one able to react. Cameras from the press TV stations and people's phones, all focused on the center of this tragedy. Althea did not blink. She remained upright, one hand still touching the flag. Blood from a small cut on her forehead, possibly from the edge of the gun's barrel, trickled down onto the medals on her chest. The dark red stain on the silver medal, the symbol of valor in battle, seemed to mock her with cruel irony. No one spoke. Not one of the 20 armored police officers surrounding the funeral dared to stop Kane. Some had tears in their eyes, but remained still, hands resting on their gun holsters. Althea slowly turned her head toward him. Her voice was hoarse but firm. "Not today." Kane pulled the trigger. Bang! The gunshot rang out sharp and decisive, tearing through the stillness of the cemetery. A few people screamed. The young soldiers rushed forward. The flag fell from Althea's hands and touched the ground. The cameras began to slow down, not because of technology, but because the entire world seemed to freeze. Lieutenant General Althea Ward sat alone in a small glass-walled room on the highest floor of the military command complex. Through the thick bulletproof windows, she could see the afternoon sun slowly descending toward the horizon of the capital. One hand rested on the deployment file. The other gripped a crumpled letter, a notification of her son's death from the Department of Defense. "We deeply regret to inform you that Captain Marcus Ward, 31st Infantry Brigade, was killed in an ambush in Ghazni Province, Afghanistan." She had read it dozens of times. No word had changed, yet each word cut deeper into her chest. Marcus was not just her son. He was the last remaining piece of her late husband, a Navy officer who had died 15 years ago. He was her hope, her pride, the reason she kept standing whenever she faltered. A soft knock echoed at the door. Lieutenant Colonel Elise Harmon, Althea's close aide, stepped in. Her eyes, hesitating. General Ward, the Department of Homeland Security, has just reported a security incident at the Houston flight route. The funeral of Captain Marcus Ward may require additional security measures. Althea looked up, her eyes as cold as ice. What are they afraid of, Elise? Is a mother in uniform going to blow up a cemetery? Elise didn't answer. Instead, she handed over a thick yellow envelope with a confidential stamp. Inside were printed encrypted messages, satellite images, and a report compiled by the Army's Criminal Investigation Division (CID). The main content: Captain Marcus Ward had submitted a special report. The topic: systematic racism targeting returning black soldiers in Texas. In the report, Marcus mentioned a group called the Watchmen, an unofficial network of police officers, administrative officials, and extremist white veterans. Their mission to prevent the rise of black people beyond their boundaries in positions of power. Marcus suspected he was being monitored after returning to the U.S. for the first time, but he was deployed back to Afghanistan before he could investigate further. Deployment. Althea frowned. She clearly remembered the transfer had come abruptly, lacking the usual vetting process. She had wondered about it, but the Pentagon files were signed by Brigadier General Maxwell Hill, a man she trusted. Althea placed the file on the table, her gaze hardening. For the first time in years, she felt anger surpassing her grief. They didn't just kill my son on the battlefield. They killed him from the corridors of this system. That night, she boarded a flight to Houston. No business class, no assistant accompanying her, no prior notice. Only a small suitcase, a neatly folded dress uniform, and a photo of Marcus in his West Point graduation uniform. When the plane landed, she didn't know that the airport's surveillance cameras had captured an image of a man stepping out of the security control room, Officer Bradley Kane. He took out his phone and made a call. The target has arrived. Brigadier General Hill ordered continuous surveillance. The funeral is the most opportune moment. The voice on the other end was dry. Do not let General Ward take the podium. If she speaks about Marcus, the entire Watchmen network will be exposed. As Althea's car drove through the streets of Houston at midnight, she had no idea that the funeral would not just be a farewell to her son. It would be the final battleground between a mother and a system that had killed her child through silence. The air in Houston was stifling humid and smelled of jet fuel. Lieutenant General Althea Ward pulled her suitcase as she descended from the domestic terminal, her deep blue military uniform as crisp as if it had just been pulled from the Academy's storeroom. Under the light pouring in from the glass dome, the ribbons on her chest glittered like stars in the daylight. Passengers stopped to look at her, not out of curiosity, but of respect. A white girl about 8 years old tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, is she a general? Just like in the movies?" The mother nodded gently and smiled at Althea. Althea bent down, shook the girl's hand, and whispered a soft, "Thank you. You can be a general too, if you want." But that warm atmosphere disappeared just minutes later at the security checkpoint. As Althea walked through the priority screening line for senior officers, a sharp voice called out, "Excuse me, you need to stop." Additional screening. Random. Bradley Kane. The senior security officer at the airport in his dark blue police uniform had steel-colored eyes and a mouth that wore a smile that never reached his eyes. A few passengers hesitated when they heard his voice, harsh, disrespectful, and not random. Althea handed over her military ID and order file. "I'm Lieutenant General Althea Ward. I just flew in from Washington. My orders are clear. I need to attend my son's funeral." Kane took the ID, pretending to scrutinize it. Then he chuckled. "You're saying you're a general? The real deal, not cosplay." A black officer in uniform being questioned about theft. Althea took a deep breath. She had heard such insults before when she was a lieutenant locked out of a general's hall when she was called sweetheart in a Pentagon meeting. But this time was different. "I'm an officer confirmed by the Senate. My rank is high enough to call you in for questioning if I choose." Yeah, Kane sneered. We still need to check. Uniforms can be stolen. Military IDs are as easy to fake as printing a menu. No one nearby spoke. Two young TSA officers exchanged glances, but didn't dare intervene. Kane jerked his head, signaling, "Take off your jacket with the medal's electronic check. Open the bag. Show everything." Althea removed her dress uniform, each motion like shedding blood. The medal's symbols of 30 years of sacrifice, combat, and loss were placed on the cold aluminum table, like a second funeral to her pride. She said nothing. 30 minutes passed, then an hour, then almost 2. Every item in her suitcase was turned inside out. Every deployment paper was examined with a magnifying glass. Kane asked, "Why are you flying to Texas alone? Who sent you? Can this be verified?" Amira Ward, her daughter, a civil rights lawyer, hurried over, her face flushed angrily. "Mom. Oh my God, are you okay? They said you're being investigated. What the hell is going on here?" Kane blocked her way. "You have no authority. If you continue disrupting security, I'll have to arrest you for obstruction of justice." Amira pulled out her phone and began recording. "Try me." A female officer approached, whispering in Kane's ear. He glanced toward the surveillance cameras. Maybe someone higher up was watching. After a fake sigh, he threw the papers back on the table. "Fine. Nothing was found. You can go. But my advice is to cooperate earlier next time. Not everyone in uniform is a hero. No apology, no report, no explanation." Althea picked up her uniform and slowly put it back on, each movement reaffirming her dignity. Before leaving, she looked directly at Kane. "You just checked a 4-star general, but don't mistake it, you're not the first to try to humiliate me, and you won't be the last to regret it." On the surveillance screen, Kane watched her walk away, then picked up his phone. "The target has been identified. The system is still operational. Prepare for the next step." The response on the other end was brief. "Good. Don't let her speak at the funeral, and don't let anyone survive if the truth gets out." The house where Lieutenant General Althea Ward had grown up stood at the corner of Milburn and Delano in the historic 3rd Ward, the heart of the black community in Houston. The brown brick house with a red-tiled roof and a time-worn wooden swing on the front porch was not just where she called home. It symbolized everything she had ever fought for: family, memories, and honor. The living room lights were on. The walls were covered with medals, photographs, and in the center, an old portrait, Althea, in her military academy graduation ceremony. Marcus, then just 6 years old, wearing a little soldier's uniform, standing beside her, saluting like a real soldier. On the old wooden table was a box marked "Do Not Open," personal, which she had found in Marcus's suitcase sent back from Afghanistan before his death. It was sealed carefully, along with a letter. "If you don't come back, open this. But Mom, only when you feel strong enough to face it. I'm sorry. M." Althea opened the lid. Inside was a silver USB drive, a map of Houston with red marks all over it, and an SD card containing a series of videos. She plugged the USB into her laptop. The first title appeared on the screen: Gatekeeping. Draft 1, Manipulating Returning Black Soldiers. Marcus's voice echoed, calm, cohesive, but there was something in his voice that sent shivers down her spine. "They don't need guns to destroy us. They need the system. Police courts, the media, paperwork. A fake search warrant is enough. An accusation with no witnesses. And then we vanish." The footage included scenes secretly recorded by Marcus, a group of police officers chatting in a bar, joking that black soldiers coming home think they're heroes. A report on black officers being fined for traffic violations 3 times the average rate. A recorded conversation, a voice unmistakable. Brigadier General Maxwell Hill, who had signed Marcus's transfer orders, saying Ward's getting too close to it. Better get him somewhere where an accident can happen. Althea froze. Someone had intentionally sent Marcus to the most dangerous part of Afghanistan, not because of the war, but to silence him. There was no war here, only a systemic assassination plot. The doorbell rang 3 quick knocks too short, the old signal Marcus used when he came home. She opened the door. Standing before her was a young man of Asian descent in plain clothes, his face tense. "Are you Lieutenant General Althea Ward?" "I'm Officer Daniel Vu, Houston PD, Marcus's best friend. I'm the one who helped him with his investigation." She nodded slightly, motioning for him to come inside. Daniel spread a map of the area on the table. The marked locations matched with controversial incidents in the black community, people shot while walking, people arrested without cause, and people who went missing after returning from the military. They call themselves the Watchmen, a group of extremist veterans within the police force covered by the system. They see black officers as a threat to the traditional structure. Marcus was going to expose everything after a veteran's funeral earlier this year, but he was deployed to the front lines a week before. Althea sat still. Every fiber in her body seemed to scream. "Do you believe Marcus was harmed?" she asked. Daniel answered without hesitation. "Not just believe. I have the evidence. But to expose it, we need you to speak out. And you have to be careful. They won't let it slide if you do it in front of the crowd." Althea looked down at the photo of her son, then turned to the map. "I will speak at the funeral, in front of the media, in front of the entire military, and if necessary in front of all of America." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then we need to prepare carefully, because the people behind this won't just point guns at you. They'll shoot straight at the truth." A weathered wooden sign hung on the barn door reading "Closed for private event." The dim lights inside barely illuminated the air thick with cigar smoke and cheap bourbon. This was Lyndon's Bar and Grill, the after-hours hangout for the police force of Houston. But tonight, the bar was closed, not for partying, but for a secret meeting. Inside, 7 white men, mostly balding with potbellies and hardened faces exuding disdain for the world, sat around a long table. On the table was an enlarged map of Jefferson Cemetery, with red circles marking areas labeled North Watch, Sniper Hill, Podium Control, and Exit Intercept. At the head of the table, Bradley Kane took a drag from his cigar, flicking the ash onto the funeral plan layout, as if he were spreading dust on someone else's life. "General Ward will speak at 10:15. The news will broadcast live. The cameras will be here and here," he said, pointing at the map. Officer Bill Heffley, the oldest in the group, shook his head. "You sure this is worth it?" "She's a general. If this blows up, the whole military command will jump in." Kane sneered, his face filled with contempt. "Exactly because she's a general, we have to act. If she speaks about Marcus, everything he collected will spread. The media congress, the Pentagon, the higher-ups will use her as a symbol. And then the game is over." Another man nodded. "The Watchmen don't exist on paper, but we exist in action. A social order can't be maintained if these minorities keep getting pushed to the top. She's a threat, not just to the police, to the entire American order." Robert Gaines. The Houston police chief walked in. The door closed behind him with a sound like the lock on a darkened room. Gaines wore a white shirt and gray tie and had a tall, gloomy frame. On his left chest, a metal badge did not display the official police emblem, but the symbol of the Watchman, an iron eye between a broken flag. He glanced at everyone before speaking in a low voice. "I've received word. The FBI has opened a file on Marcus Ward. They're linking his death to racial discrimination within the force. A guy named Daniel Vu is providing evidence. The entire network will be exposed if we can't stop General Ward." No one breathed. Gaines looked at Kane. "You're in charge of the funeral. Do it like you've done before. Smooth no traces left. And remember, don't kill anyone. We don't need martyrs. We need an explainable event. Like a security breach, an act of resistance, a situation where she gets handcuffed on live TV." Kane nodded slightly, as if everything were already in his hands. Let her kneel at her son's grave, in handcuffs, on national television. Everyone raised their glasses. For America. Meanwhile, at Althea's home, she, Daniel, and Amira reviewed the recordings Marcus had collected. An encrypted file had just been decoded. In it, a man's voice, clear, deep, and familiar, rang out. "Let her speak." Then, when she touches the flag, stop her. A warning shot. A shove. Every camera will capture the dangerous behavior. At that point, who will believe a black woman being handcuffed? Daniel's face turned pale. Amira slammed her fist on the table. "These people aren't just racist. They've scripted the media to destroy Mom's reputation." Althea stood up, her voice cold as ice. "They killed Marcus with a transfer order. They won't kill his mother with a camera shot." She turned and looked at the security camera in the corner she knew. Now every step she took, every breath she took, was in their crosshairs. And that, she knew, made her more dangerous than ever. The sky was overcast, a dense fog hanging low, as if nature itself refused to grant sunlight for the coming day. The day a son would be buried, and a conspiracy would attempt to bury the truth with him. Lieutenant General Althea Ward strolled along the stone-paved path leading to the Valor section of Jefferson Cemetery, designated for soldiers who died in battle. Her hair was neatly tied back, her face calm like still water, but her eyes were sharp like military steel. The cemetery caretaker, Thomas Wells, a pale-skinned man, nervously held a clipboard waiting for her at the gate. "General Ward," he began, his voice uneasy. We apologize, but there's been a small change." Althea frowned. "Change. Every procedure from the section to the plot has been approved by the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense." Wells licked his lips. "Yes, but we received a notice from the police department about security. They recommended holding the funeral in the East Garden, larger and easier to manage the crowd." Althea sighed and looked at him as if he were a student caught in a lie. The East Garden was once where black soldiers were buried, back when legal segregation existed. You know that. And Marcus didn't die to return to a segregated cemetery. Before Wells could respond, a voice spoke from behind. "You're right." A middle-aged man wearing a dust-covered blue work shirt stepped forward. On his shirt was embroidered the name Michael Saunders, groundskeeper. His face was weathered, his eyes older than his years, but his silent pride was evident. "My son served with Captain Marcus Ward in Afghanistan. They called each other brothers. If anyone deserves to be buried in the honor section, it's Marcus." Michael placed a photo in Althea's hands. In the photo, Marcus and a young white soldier, both in camouflage uniforms, sitting on a dusty tank, arms slung around each other, smiling like two children. "My son David Saunders died a week before Marcus, in the same battle. That photo was taken 2 days before they both died." Wells lowered his head. I'm sorry. I'll personally oversee the preparations in the Valor section." Althea gently squeezed Michael's hand. "Thank you for not staying silent." Michael nodded. "They can move the earth, but I tend to it. I know who comes, who goes." He looked directly into her eyes and lowered his voice. "In the past 2 days, some officers came here not in uniform. They asked for the funeral layout map and asked in detail where you would stand when receiving the flag. One was the officer who caused the stir at the airport." Althea's spine went cold. Later that day, Amira entered the hotel's living room, handing her mother a thick envelope with no name. Someone left this at the front desk. They didn't say who. Inside was a hand-drawn sketch of the funeral layout. A woman holding a flag was marked with a red crosshair, symbolizing a sniper's aim. Beneath it, a single line read, "Silence her before she speaks." Althea said nothing. She stood up, opened her suitcase, and took out her dress uniform. Her hands smoothed the fabric flat, like polishing a weapon. Tomorrow is Marcus's funeral. But it is also the day the system must choose. Will it continue shooting at the truth, or stand up to face it? Amira tightened her grip on her mother's shoulder. "We won't let you fight alone, Mom." Late that night, in the Houston Police Department's command room, Police Chief Gaines and Bradley Kane were reviewing the funeral layout. The moment when the flag is passed is the golden moment. If we hesitate for even a second, we lose everything. Kane replied coldly, "Don't worry. This time, the cameras will capture exactly what we want. She'll be taken down. By gun, by media, or by deep-rooted prejudice." Gaines nodded. "Let America see that even as a general, if your skin is black, you still have to bow your head." But they had forgotten one thing. Lieutenant General Althea Ward had never bowed her head, not even when forced to kneel before her son's grave. The early morning fog had not yet lifted, but Jefferson Cemetery was already packed. Nearly 300 white chairs were neatly arranged in front of the flag-draped grave. The American flag fluttered gently in the wind, but the atmosphere was suffocating, as if everyone were holding their breath for something no one dared speak of. Media outlets had set up tents outside. Over 15 major television networks were live-streaming the event, a military funeral for a young captain who died on the battlefield, the son of Lieutenant General Althea Ward, the highest-ranking black woman in the international peacekeeping forces. Military personnel in dress uniforms marched in their lines, crisp and disciplined. Marcus's old comrades, veterans, politicians, community leaders, and black civilians, everyone was there. A few quietly carried minor signs. Marcus Ward deserved better. Honor the dead. Protect the living. In the distance, a white older man stood silently leaning on a cane. He was Brigadier General Edward Monroe, Althea's former military academy instructor. When he saw her arrive, he saluted her solemnly and silently. 09:58 a.m. Althea entered the main ceremony area. Her dark blue dress uniform was perfectly pressed. The medals on her chest reflected the sunlight like shards of glass. Her face was the stillness of someone who had survived 3 battlefields, but her eyes held a storm. She walked toward the front row where her father, Vietnam War veteran Wallace Ward, and daughter Amira were seated. No one spoke. They held hands like a silent front. Around the high points surrounding the funeral, Amira's team had quietly installed security cameras. The footage would be live-streamed from 3 angles, not just for television, but to protect the truth. But the Houston police were not standing still. In full uniform, Bradley Kane led a security team of 20 all-confirmed members of the Watchmen group. They were stationed at strategic points, the entrance behind the podium near the press tent. Beneath their sunglasses and radios were cold, purposeful glances. White people were processed quickly through security, taking only seconds. But black people, even in military uniforms, were asked to open their bags and show their papers, and some were even refused entry due to security concerns. A group of black veterans protested. One man shouted, "Did he die to protect this?" Treated like a criminal at his funeral. A cold officer replied, "Violation of procedure. We have the right to arrest." No one was arrested. But the crowd bitterly understood the funeral had been divided by skin color. 10:00 a.m. The ceremony began. The bugle sounded. The flag was folded into a triangle. The minister choked up as he spoke of a loyal son, a courageous soldier. Marcus's comrades, one by one, recounted the final moments, how he shielded his comrades from gunfire, how he saved a child from a bombing in the village. but everyone was waiting for the speech from Lieutenant General Althea Ward. 10:14 a.m. Althea stepped up to the podium. The entire cemetery held its breath. She opened the paper, not to read, but to prove that she was here, prepared not impulsively, as those conspiring against her would try to label her. I do not stand here only as a mother who has lost her son. I stand here as a soldier who swore to protect this country from all enemies, whether from without or within. The entire room fell into absolute silence. She continued, My son, Captain Marcus Ward died on the battlefield, but the real reason lies within the file I hold here. Whispers spread. Kane squinted, his hand resting on his weapon belt. Marcus investigated a network of police officers and officials deliberately targeting black soldiers returning home. They were set up, lost their jobs, and were defamed. And some, like my son, were sent to dangerous places not due to tactics, but due to politics. 10:17 a.m. Kane stepped forward. His earpiece crackled with a signal. General Ward, please step down from the podium. For security reasons. Althea turned to him, her eyes never blinking. I am speaking. Step back. 10:18 a.m. One of the officers behind gave a signal. Bang! A warning shot rang out. The crowd panicked. Kane shouted, She's drawing a weapon. She's got a gun. No one saw anything because she had nothing in her hands. But just then, Kane lunged forward, shoving Althea to the ground. The folded flag box fell from her hand, rolling into the mud before her son's gravestone. Blood from her forehead stained her dress uniform. One of her medals fell out covered in mud. The media held their breath. Cameras captured the image of the general being handcuffed face down on the cold ground beside her son's grave. The entire cemetery erupted in shouts. From the front row, Amira screamed, Don't touch my mother! It's all being recorded! She pointed to the cameras. A white soldier standing in the honor guard stepped forward. She did nothing. I'm a witness. Kane still held her down, shouting, She's conspiring against national security. Handcuff her. The cameras kept rolling. No one expected that a moment of silence for the dead would become the nation's moment to witness an assassination of honor right before their eyes. The smell of bleached metal and cold sweat filled the air of the women's holding cell at Harris County Jail. Still in her bloodied and muddy dress uniform, General Althea Ward sat upright on the cold steel chair. Her hands were shackled tightly behind her back with scratched handcuffs. Her eyes did not tear. But no one mistook it. She was in pain. Not from the gash on her forehead, but because a symbol had been buried not of a soldier, but of the truth itself. Outside the jail gate, reporters jostled, and dozens of cameras were live streaming the event. The online community was ablaze. Clips from the funeral had spread across platforms with millions of shares within just 2 hours. The prominent headlines read, General Althea Ward, arrested during son's funeral cameras. Capture the heartbreaking truth. Why was a mother in uniform treated like a criminal who's America really for? In a small cafe in Washington, D.C., FBI agent Dominic Carter, a civil rights crime investigator, stared at the screen, his teeth clenched. They just turned a 4-star general into a suspect. Live. On national television. At that moment, his phone rang. Amira Ward. Agent Carter. I'm her daughter. I have documents, evidence, video. Marcus left it. My mother has been set up, and this involves both the military and the Houston police. Carter clenched his jaw. I'll be in Houston within 3 hours. Keep everyone safe. And don't trust anyone in uniform. Inside the jail, Althea was brought into the interrogation room. The bright light shone directly in her face while the camera filmed from a high angle. A middle-aged white woman, Investigator Jackson, sat across from her, polite but cold. You are charged with resisting arrest, threatening the security of the ceremony, and engaging in organized disruptive behavior. Do you have anything to say? Althea responded in a voice as hard as a stone. My son died because this system killed him with a transfer order. And today, you are trying to do the same to me, with handcuffs instead of a gun. Jackson remained silent, not blinking. And you think you'll get away with it? You may be a general, but in this room, you are a detainee. Althea smiled thinly. And to the millions of people out there, I am the truth you are trying to bury. 3:03 p.m. Outside the jail, veteran civilians and active duty soldiers began to gather. They wore military uniforms, T-shirts with Marcus' image carrying banners. Free General Ward, honor the fallen. Not the badge. This is what injustice looks like. A group of black veterans from Marcus' unit stood silently holding flags, eyes fixed on the gate. No one shouted. No one vandalized. They stood there, bearing witness. 5:22 p.m. Inside the jail, a guard rushed into the interrogation room, handing a directive to Jackson. Order from the Department of Justice. The FBI is taking over. You need to hand her over. Jackson stood up, her eyes fluttering only once. When Althea's handcuffs were removed, a female staff member silently handed her the cleaned dress uniform. But one medal was missing. Althea looked at the space on her left chest and sighed. They can take one medal, but they can't take the reason I earned it. 6:05 p.m. As Althea walked out of Harris County Jail, the flashbulbs from hundreds of photographers flickered non-stop. Ahead of her was Agent Carter, holding his federal badge high. Beside him was Amira, her eyes red, but her steps steady. Althea stood amidst the crowd of veterans alone in her wrinkled dress uniform, the dried blood still on her medal. But her back was straight, and her gaze was fixed on the camera. I am Lieutenant General Althea Ward. Today, they handcuffed me. Tomorrow I will handcuff this system with the truth. The crowd erupted in applause. Flags flew again. But this time it wasn't to bid farewell to the dead. It was to welcome a new fight. Lieutenant General Althea Ward sat in the closed-door meeting room on the 12th floor of the federal building in Houston. The room was so quiet that a pen moving across paper was audible. Across from her sat Agent Dominic Carter, the FBI's civil rights specialist. To his left was Inspector Eleanor Rios from Internal Affairs, and to his right sat her daughter, Amira Ward, an attorney now like a warrior in a gray suit, her red eyes but unwavering spirit. On the table were 3 thick, heavy dossiers, each burning with the truth it held. File 1. A recording of a Watchmen meeting secretly captured by Marcus. File 2. A fraudulent deployment report within the military, signed by Brigadier General Maxwell Hill. File 3. Evidence of an unlawful interrogation at the funeral, including footage from an independent camera, clearly showing no threatening behavior from Althea. Agent Carter set his pen down. General Ward, we've identified at least 27 officers and former military personnel involved in the Watchmen group. This group doesn't just operate in Houston. It extends to Dallas, San Antonio, and even some military units. If this evidence is true, you are standing at the heart of a national scandal. Althea leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving the file. This isn't if, it's all true, and they killed my son to cover it up. A moment later, Carter continued. You can remain silent. You can let us handle an internal investigation. No one will blame you. Althea shook her head, slow but decisive. They used my son's funeral to turn me into a symbol of treason. I will use that funeral and everything left to drag them into the light. Amira nodded. We demand a public hearing with media coverage, Congress, and the military. We will sue the Houston Police Department for civil rights violations and press criminal charges against the individuals involved. That afternoon, Washington, D.C. The news spread like wildfire. General Althea Ward officially submits federal evidence on racial discrimination within Houston Police. FBI expands investigation. The Watchmen are no longer an urban legend. The mother handcuffed at her son's funeral becomes the face of the fight for justice for Black soldiers. Veterans organizations across the country spoke out. Black military groups held press conferences. On Twitter, the hashtag Justice for Marcus Ward rose to the top of global trends within just 4 hours. The next day, United States Congress special hearing. The entire chamber went silent when Althea stepped up to the witness stand. More than 300 people were present, including lawmakers, military leaders, and community representatives. Millions watched live on television and social media. No notes, no reading. She looked directly into the eyes of everyone present. I've survived 3 wars, but I've never encountered an enemy more insidious than the fear of a system when a Black person becomes too exceptional. My son did not die from bombs or bullets. He died because of the fear of a group of people who believe military glory is reserved for white men. They use handcuffs instead of medals, accusations instead of evidence, guns not to protect, but to silence the truth. She paused, her eyes locked on the camera. And today I'm not just reclaiming Marcus's honor. I'm reclaiming the voices of all the soldiers who stayed silent because they were threatened. They didn't speak, but I will speak for them. The chamber rose in applause. Not the polite applause of courtesy, but applause from the heart, from the anger now given a voice it deserved. After the hearing, a series of actions were initiated. The FBI expanded its investigation into neighboring states. The Department of Defense ordered a review of all deployment orders from the past 5 years. The Houston Police Department was placed under federal oversight. Brigadier General Maxwell Hill was suspended. Police Chief Robert Gaines disappeared from his workplace. And the next day, Bradley Kane, the officer who had held a gun to the temple of a mother in military uniform, turned himself in, followed by his lawyer and a carefully crafted press release. But Althea didn't care for the apology. She had stepped through the gate of justice, not to seek forgiveness, but to begin the final battle. The sun set slowly on the Houston skyline, its light casting a golden hue on the glass walls of the Texas Federal Court building, like a smoldering flame. But the actual fire was not out there. It was burning in the heart of the system, where the pillars of power began to crack, revealing fractures that could not be mended. Lieutenant General Althea Ward, now the nation's focal point, stepped out of the black armored SUV. Beside her was Amira, her daughter attorney and linguistic warrior. Behind them, Agent Dominic Carter, the FBI representative, led the most extensive federal investigation since the Ferguson case. Ahead of them, a crowd of reporters, veterans, and protesters filled the street. Signs were waving high. Marcus Ward, your voice is still heard. No more Watchmen. Don't salute injustice. Inside the building, the first hearing to accuse the underground police group, the Watchmen, was underway, and the evidence was crashing into the system like a hammer striking a pillar. Inside the FBI's internal meeting room, Agent Carter presented to federal officials, and what had once been a theory was now fact. We have confirmed the existence of a clandestine police group called the Watchmen. This group includes at least 31 active officers, 9 veterans, and 4 local judges operating as an internal network within the law enforcement agencies. He inserted a USB into the projector. The screen displayed a recording. They need to know the position. One wrong move, and they're in the line of fire. If she touches the flag act directly, the camera will capture resisting an officer. The voice: Bradley Kane. The location of the recording is a temporary command room at the Houston Police Department. At the same time, in a building near downtown, the Military Oversight Committee was holding an emergency session. Military representatives presented documents proving that Captain Marcus Ward's deployment to the dangerous area of Ghazni had not followed tactical standards. It had been done based on internal suggestions from outside the military, specifically from a Texas state senator's office. The name in the internal email: Senator Howard Maxwell, a former police chief, a covert sponsor of the traditional order program within local law enforcement, a man now running for governor of Texas. That evening, Senator Maxwell's mansion. Maxwell walked through his grand living room, the TV playing softly in the background. The broadcaster's voice: "The system is cracking beneath the old symbols of power. And it seems this time, the foundation may not hold." Maxwell raised his hand and turned off the TV. Outside the door, his close advisor entered. "Senator, we have a problem. The FBI is about to release the recording of you and Gaines. They can trace the Watchmen's funding back to your community redevelopment fund." Maxwell poured a glass of whiskey, his hand steady. All systems crack. But cracking doesn't mean they collapse, unless someone keeps pushing. The next morning, FBI headquarters, Houston. Althea sat in her private office. In front of her was a photo of Marcus, at age 10, holding up a plastic replica medal after a school laser shooting competition. Amira walked in carrying the latest report. "Mom, they're questioning 8 more officers. One of them, Lieutenant Ray Donovan, has agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity." Althea nodded slightly, her eyes still fixed on the photo of her son. The system doesn't collapse with one blow. It collapses when the people within it no longer believe in it. That afternoon, the Houston Police Department Chief Robert Gaines, who had once mocked Althea, was escorted out in handcuffs, his face shielded from the cameras. Hundreds of citizens gathered outside shouting, "We saw it. We remember. You're not invisible anymore." That evening, national television, CNN breaking news: FBI officially charges the Watchmen as a conspiracy to violate civil rights, manipulate the legal system, deploy soldiers unlawfully, and stage racial violence to maintain internal order. The image appeared Althea, standing among hundreds of veterans, both old and young, black and white, holding banners, "This is our America too." That night, Pentagon headquarters. Althea entered a meeting room where she had once been barred for lack of clearance. Now she sat at the head of the table. A general spoke. "We sincerely apologize for the harm this system has caused you and Marcus. Today, the Secretary of Defense is offering you a senior advisory role on military and civil rights reforms to consult with the President directly." Althea paused for a few seconds before answering. "I will accept, but with one condition." "What is it, General?" "When I speak, you must listen, not just to respond, but to change." The system began to crack, but something new was emerging from those cracks: not vengeance, but reform. Not just justice for one person, but a path for an entire generation. The U.S. Capitol had never been as crowded as it was that morning. Thousands had lined up since before dawn. They came from every state: retired soldiers, families of those oppressed students, professors, activists, all waiting for a hearing described as a declaration of war on a system rotten from within. International media surrounded every corner of the hallway. Banners waved in the wind. "Truth is not a threat. Silence is. From Marcus to many, we see you." And amid that morning, Lieutenant General Althea Ward entered the hearing room in full military uniform. Head held high, eyes sharp like blades tempered through 3 battlefields. The entire room stood as she entered. But one person did not. Sitting in the back row, hands clasped, was Senator Howard Maxwell, once the most powerful man in Texas, now just a man waiting for judgment. The camera panned slowly, and the historic hearing began. Chairing the hearing, Senator Eleanor Finch, a well-known white woman of integrity, opened the session. We are not here merely to investigate a civil rights violation. We are here to investigate a systemic pattern where power is cloaked in uniforms and racism is disguised by the phrase, domestic security. She turned to Althea. General Ward, are you ready to testify before Congress? I was born in a generation where black soldiers were buried in separate sections. I stood silent when my friend was kicked out of the military academy because of his skin color. But today, I will no longer stand silent. Her voice didn't tremble, but it was strong enough to make the room silent, sufficient to hear the sound of a pen turning a page in the records. My son, Captain Marcus Ward, was not killed by the Taliban. He was killed by the invisible hand of the system you once called stability. They sent him to a death zone, not because of duty, but because he knew too much. In the middle of the hearing, a key piece of evidence was played, a recording of a conversation between Police Chief Robert Gaines and Senator Howard Maxwell. Gaines Ward has the files. He has the tapes. If she speaks at the funeral, everything will burn. Maxwell, then stage a disruption, resisting an officer. At that point, she's just a suspect. The room was nearly breathless. Maxwell lowered his face. He could not make a defense for the first time in 30 years of politics. A young congressman stood up. Madam Chair, I request that Senator Maxwell be investigated for criminal charges immediately. The applause rang out. Right after the hearing, the Department of Justice released a statement. Senator Howard Maxwell will be charged with conspiracy to commit indirect murder, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and systematic civil rights violations. His assets will be seized for investigation. A week later at the Pentagon, Althea entered a hall where the Department of Defense held a ceremony to restore Marcus Ward's honor. She received the medal that had been lost at the funeral. But this time, it was personally pinned on her by the Secretary of Defense, not just for Marcus, but for all whose names had been erased from history. Later that same day, an unexpected event occurred. Bradley Kane, in a trial in Houston, stood up and revealed the entire network, including an unprecedented detail. It's not just us. The Watchmen have people in the Department of Homeland Security. They have people in military auditing. And in the White House. A bombshell. The FBI expanded its investigation nationwide. That evening, CNN Live interview. Althea appeared before millions of viewers. They thought handcuffing me was the end. But I never began with submission. I began with an oath, and today I keep my word. The host asked, "Do you still believe in this system?" Althea looked into the camera. "No, I don't believe in the old system. But if enough of us stand up, we can build a new one. And when the powerful bow their heads before justice, history does not record their downfall. It records the rise of those who were once forced to remain silent." The sky was clear, the sun gentle, and the wind swept through the small flags planted along the nation's most prestigious military cemetery entrance. Today, at the National Heroes Memorial, a funeral was being held, but not to bury a soldier. It was to complete a truth that had once been handcuffed. Over 1,000 people from across the United States gathered Marcus Ward's comrades, representatives of veterans organizations, active duty officers, civil rights leaders, ROTC students. At the center of all eyes, Lieutenant General Althea Ward stepped onto the stage for the first time, with a 4-star rank officially promoted at the Department of Defense's recommendation and the President's approval. Beside her stood Amira, now the official spokesperson for the National Military and Judicial Reform Committee, along with Agent Dominic Carter, the man who had turned the investigation into justice. 09:15 a.m. The sound of the bugle echoed slow and solemn. The flag which had once fallen during the previous funeral was now carefully folded, pristine, and placed into Althea's hands like an apology from an entire nation. A young soldier stepped forward and saluted. "On behalf of the President of the United States, the armed forces, and a nation that owes Captain Marcus Ward more than thanks. We respectfully present this flag to you." Althea took it and held it close. No tears, no trembling, just a nod, as a vow to never let anyone else endure this silence again. After the ceremony, the entire country watched Althea's speech live from Arlington. 6 months ago, my son was buried when the truth was twisted into a threat. They handcuffed me before national media thinking that honor could be humiliated. But today, from right here, where people like me were once denied, I declare, the days of silence are over. She paused, her eyes staring directly into the camera. My son Marcus is dead, but his death gave birth to a law. The Marcus Ward Military Justice Act, passed by Congress, establishes protections for military personnel against racial discrimination from enlistment to discharge and enforces strict penalties for manipulating deployment orders. The crowd stood. The applause was deafening. At the same time, in Texas, Senator Howard Maxwell was sentenced to the maximum penalty conspiracy to commit manslaughter through unlawful deployment orders, obstruction of a federal investigation, systematic civil rights violations, total sentence, life imprisonment without parole. In federal prison, he no longer had a name, only a number and the memory of power he once thought was invincible. In Houston, the police department was officially placed under civilian oversight for 10 years. A new internal unit named Unit 44 was formed and led by Lieutenant Daniel Vu, the officer who had helped Marcus in the initial investigation. A few weeks later, Althea stood before the newly established headquarters of the organization she founded, the Marcus Ward Foundation for Truth in Uniform, a training, legal, and psychological counseling center for Black military personnel, returning soldiers, and even police officers seeking to leave the old system and stand for justice. The large sign in front of the building read, "We are not building a new America. We are simply forcing America to keep its old promise." That evening, at the Lincoln Memorial, Washington, D.C., hundreds of candles were lit. A group of Black students performed the Lift Every Voice and Sing anthem, which is often called the Black National Anthem of the United States. At the front, Althea stood silently holding Marcus's flag tightly. A reporter approached and asked, "Ma'am, what do you think made all of this possible?" She replied, her eyes never leaving the candles, "I think. Sometimes to awaken a nation, a mother must rise even amid a funeral." And so, in the United States, that had once handcuffed the truth, a mother turned grief into law, turned silence into a banner, turned a funeral into a declaration of war.